The sea was endless and gray, and so was the silence aboard the transport ship. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners sat in rows, shivering under coarse blankets as the wind howled through the steel hull. They had fought to the edge of exhaustion, some captured after island skirmishes, others pulled from shattered garrisons. Now, stripped of rank and weapon, they were being taken to the land of the enemy, America. Rumors spread through the hold like whispers in a storm. Some believed they would be executed on arrival, others that they'd be forced into slavery or medical experiments. They had been told since childhood that Americans were monsters, men without honor, destroyers of families and nations. No one expected mercy. Certainly not comfort. Days passed. The air reeked of salt and rust, and the men barely spoke. But amid fear, a few began to notice strange details. The guards brought them meals regularly, sometimes even offering extra water. When one prisoner fell ill, a medic treated him without hesitation. It didn't fit the image of the barbaric enemy they had been taught to hate. When land finally appeared on the horizon, the dark outline of the American coast, many turned away, bracing for humiliation. They were sure that what awaited them would erase whatever remained of their dignity. But what awaited them was something entirely different, not cruelty, but confusion. Not hunger, but abundance. And it would begin, unexpectedly, with a smell drifting from the camp kitchen, the sizzle of oil, the scent of something golden and warm that none of them recognized yet. They didn't know it then, but they were about to encounter the most American of symbols, a simple, salted strip of fried potato, and through it, witness a contradiction so profound it would haunt them long after the war was over. When the trucks finally stopped and the prisoners were ordered to step out, the air bit sharply against their faces. Snow covered the ground. The first many had ever seen. The camp lay spread across a field of frost, surrounded by wire fences and wooden guard towers. Yet there was something oddly clean about it. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, and the smell of cooked food drifted faintly through the crisp winter air. The Japanese soldiers glanced at one another, hesitant. They expected barking orders, blows, maybe dogs. But the American guards spoke in calm, clear tones. One of them, seeing the prisoners' confusion, motioned toward a long wooden barack with warmth inside. "Food," he said, gesturing. Inside, rows of tables were laid out with trays of bread, meat, and something none of them recognized. Long, thin golden strips piled beside a bottle filled with dark liquid that fizzed when opened. The prisoners stared at it all, disbelieving. For men who had survived on stale rice, salted fish, and boiled weeds, this was unthinkable luxury. One young soldier, Sato, looked down at his tray and whispered, "They are mocking us." His comrade shook his head, equally unsure. Could it be poison? Could the Americans be offering this abundance only to humiliate them further? But hunger overcame suspicion. Slowly, a few began to eat. The bread was soft, the meat rich with flavor, and the golden strips, crispy on the outside, tender inside, tasted like nothing they had ever known. Salt lingered on their tongues, and the faint oiliness carried a warmth that felt almost human. Then came the drink. Cold, sparkling, sweet, and strange, Coca-Cola. When it hit their throats, several coughed in surprise, eyes widening in astonishment. Others began to laugh, real laughter, the first since capture. One older soldier set his cup down and wiped his eyes. "Why," he murmured, "does the enemy feed us like honored guests?" The question would echo through the camp long after that first meal was over. That night, the camp was eerily quiet. The usual mutters of resentment, the whispers of escape, the sighs in the dark, all had vanished. The prisoners lay on their bunks, staring at the rafters, lost in thought. For months, they had dreamed of food, warm rice, soup, anything to fill their hollow stomachs. But they had never imagined this, food made not from necessity, but from abundance. Food that seemed to exist for no other reason than pleasure. Sato turned to the man beside him. "Did you see the way they fried those potatoes?" he asked softly. "In oil, as if oil were nothing. And they eat them with salt. So much salt." His comrade laughed bitterly. In Japan, salt is rationed. Here, they throw it on food for flavor. But there was no hatred in his tone, only disbelief. Somewhere in that disbelief, something began to shift. The enemy no longer seemed entirely monstrous. Perhaps they were still enemies, but they were human. And worse, they were capable of comfort in a way that made the prisoners question their own world. Later, one of the guards passed by the bunks, whistling. He had a carton of French fries in hand, eating absent-mindedly as he made his rounds. The smell lingered in the cold air, golden and salty. Every man in the barrack could smell it, that faint, irresistible aroma that mixed oil, earth, and something impossible to name. Sato couldn't sleep. He kept thinking of that taste, the crunch, the warmth, the faint sweetness of the potato beneath the salt. It wasn't just food. It was proof of a civilization built on a kind of comfort that Japan, exhausted by war, could no longer even imagine. He turned on his side, eyes open to the dark, and whispered, "If this is how they treat prisoners, how do they treat their own?" It wasn't just hunger that unsettled him now. It was the realization that the war might have been fought not only between armies, but between ways of living. The next morning, the prisoners were lined up again for breakfast. Snow drifted lazily from the gray Wisconsin sky, and the camp mess hall buzzed with the clatter of trays and utensils. The same strange smell filled the air, fried potatoes sizzling in oil. Many of the men, still suspicious, took their food without meeting anyone's eyes. But curiosity had replaced fear. When they sat down, some began to talk about the flavor, the texture, even the shape of the golden strips. "How do they make them all the same size?" one asked quietly. Another replied, "They must have machines for this. Imagine that, machines just to cut potatoes." For men who had seen entire factories turned into weapons plants, the idea of an industry built for comfort was unimaginable. And yet here it was, on their plates, the taste of an America they had been told did not exist. As they ate, one of the guards walked by. He was young, barely older than the prisoners themselves, and noticed their fascination. Smiling, he reached into his own pocket, pulled out a small packet, and tore it open. Ketchup. He poured it onto the fries in front of them and gestured for them to try. The prisoners hesitated. The red sauce looked like blood. But when one finally dipped a fry and took a bite, his eyes widened. "Sweet and sour," he murmured. "Like something for a festival." Soon, others followed. A few even laughed, unable to contain their surprise. To the Americans, it was nothing, an ordinary meal. To the Japanese, it was an emotional paradox, the enemy offering warmth and flavor in a world of ashes. It defied everything they'd been taught. When one prisoner bowed slightly toward the cook behind the counter, the gesture was small, almost instinctive. But it meant something profound. It was gratitude, quiet, cautious, and deeply human. That morning, the war felt a little further away, and the world a little wider than the borders they had once vowed to die for. By the end of the week, the meals had become a quiet ritual. Every day, at the same hour, the smell of frying potatoes filled the camp, and the prisoners gathered, forming lines that no one needed to enforce. Hunger drew them, but something else kept them there, curiosity, maybe even reverence. Inside the mess hall, they learned the rhythm of American food, the sizzling oil, the hum of machines slicing potatoes into perfect strips, the hiss of carbonation as bottles of Coca-Cola were opened and poured. To men raised in a culture that prized simplicity and restraint, it felt almost decadent. One afternoon, an American officer entered the hall. He spoke slowly, with an interpreter beside him. "You will work in the fields," he said, "and in return, you will be treated with respect. You will eat well, rest well, and live honorably." The words sounded strange in Japanese: eat well, rest well, things they had not associated with war for years. After the officer left, the interpreter, a Nisei soldier with Japanese ancestry, stayed behind for a moment. He smiled awkwardly. "They don't see you as animals," he said softly. "They see you as men who are doing their duty." The prisoners stared back, unsure what to make of it. Back home, Surrender was the ultimate disgrace. And yet, here, the enemy treated them not as traitors or beasts, but as people. At dinner, the guards sometimes ate the same food beside them. They shared jokes, though few words were understood. Laughter filled the hall, awkward, genuine, human. It was in those moments that the boundaries blurred, captor and captive, soldier and cook, enemy and fellow eater. When the lights dimmed and the plates were cleared, a strange silence followed, not born of fear, but reflection. Some of the men looked down at their hands, still holding the faint grease of the fries, and realized they were holding proof of something they could not name. It wasn't just food. It was mercy, and it terrified them more than cruelty ever could. In the weeks that followed, life in the camp settled into a strange rhythm of work, rest, and unexpected comfort. The Japanese prisoners worked in nearby fields, chopped wood, repaired tools. And each day ended the same way, with a meal that reminded them they were still alive. What lingered most wasn't the meat or the bread, but the fries. They became a quiet obsession, the sound of sizzling oil, the way steam curled from the pile when it hit their trays, the golden crispness that seemed to shine in the light of the mess hall lamps. For Sato and his comrades, the fries came to mean something more than food. They were proof of a world that could afford gentleness, a world that valued flavor over survival. In Japan, food had become ritualized scarcity, rice counted by the grain, fish bones boiled twice, hunger endured in silence. Here, salt was scattered by hand, and oil flowed freely, luxuries that seemed almost impossible. One evening, while eating in silence, Sato turned to the Nisei interpreter and asked, "Why do you give us food like this? Aren't we your enemies?" The interpreter paused before answering. "Maybe once," he said. "Now you're just men who are far from home." That answer hit harder than Sato expected. He looked around at the faces of his fellow prisoners, thin, tired, yet softening day by day, and realized that even their posture had changed. Shoulders once tensed in defiance now eased slightly when the food arrived. Sometimes he caught himself smiling. He hated that. It felt like betrayal. But when he tasted that crisp salt again, when the warmth filled his chest, it reminded him of something he hadn't felt since childhood: peace. At night, as the wind whistled outside the barracks, some men whispered to each other about what they would tell their families if they ever returned. None of them spoke about battle anymore. They spoke about food, about the kindness of their captors, and about the day they first learned that mercy could be salted, golden, and fried. By early spring, snow had melted into mud, and the camp thawed with it. The once frozen fields around the fences were now brown and soft, dotted with the first hints of green. The prisoners worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences and clearing debris, and in exchange, they continued to receive the same strange mercy: hot meals, clean beds, even cigarettes. And yet, the contradictions gnawed at them. Every act of kindness from the Americans was a quiet wound to their pride. Japan had taught them that honor came from endurance, that suffering purified the soul. But here, the enemy offered comfort instead of pain. Sato often watched the American cooks at work. They moved with casual precision, humming to themselves, tossing potatoes into vats of oil with ease. He couldn't understand how people capable of such destruction, of burning cities like Tokyo, could also create something so simple, so generous, as a plate of French fries. One day, while cleaning the mess hall, he found a stack of old newspapers in English. On the front page was a photo: a smiling American family eating fries at a diner, a glass of Coca-Cola on the table, a jukebox in the background. The caption read, "A taste of home." The word stuck in his mind. A taste of home. The phrase was unthinkable in his language, where food had always been a duty, a necessity. Here, it was something to celebrate. That night, while eating, he whispered to a fellow prisoner, "For them, even food is happiness." His comrade nodded slowly. "And for us, food was always survival." The difference wasn't just cultural, it was emotional. The Americans seemed to eat for joy, for connection, while the Japanese had been taught to eat quietly, almost guiltily, as if pleasure itself were weakness. Sato took another fry, dipped it in ketchup, and stared at the bright red smear on his plate. It looked like war, but tasted like peace. And that, he realized, was the deepest contradiction of all. The Red Cross allowed prisoners to send brief letters home, 30 words, no more. Most used the space to write of health, of survival. But for many, the hardest part was deciding what not to say. Sato sat on his bunk one evening, pencil trembling in his hand, staring at the small form. He wanted to write about the snow, the strange kindness, the taste of potatoes fried in oil until they shone like gold. But how could he? His mother was likely still rationing rice, standing in long queues under air raid sirens. How could he tell her that the enemy fed him better than his own army ever had? He finally wrote, "I am alive. I am being treated well. The food is warm." Then he stopped, staring at the last words, "The food is warm." It sounded small, but to him, it meant everything. Warmth meant humanity. Across the barack, others struggled with the same conflict. One man whispered to another, "If my wife knew how I live here, she would think I am lying." Another replied softly, "Better let her think so. Better that than shame." For Japanese soldiers, captivity was dishonor. To live while comrades died was already a silent burden. But to live well, to laugh, to eat, to find comfort, that was unbearable guilt. Still, none could deny what they felt when they tasted the fries, or when the guards smiled at them without malice. Each small kindness was a quiet assault on the wall they had built around their beliefs. When the letters were finally collected, Sato looked at his words one last time. He had written truth, but not the whole truth. The warmth he spoke of was not only the heat of food, it was the warmth of an unexpected compassion that unsettled him far more than hunger ever had. And as the lights dimmed that night, he realized something deeply uncomfortable. Kindness could wound the proud more deeply than cruelty. Spring had settled fully over the camp, though the air remained sharp in the mornings. Patches of green had begun to blanket the fields, and the prisoners, now accustomed to the rhythm of labor and the strange benevolence of their captors, moved with a mechanical efficiency that barely registered in their minds. Yet the meals remained the center of their small, constrained universe. The sizzle of oil, the golden glint of fries piled on trays, and the sharp sweetness of Coca-Cola were anchors in a world that had otherwise unraveled their sense of reality. Sato began to notice subtler things in the camp, the laughter of the American cooks as they worked together, the way one guard would pause to brush snow from a prisoner's jacket, the casual ease with which a soldier would offer a cigarette or a small, folded candy to someone too timid to ask. None of this fit into the mental framework he had carried for years, the stark dichotomy of enemy and self, predator and prey. These were small, almost invisible acts, yet they struck him like a hammer against the brittle shell of his pride. One afternoon, during a brief pause from fieldwork, Sato and a small group of men huddled near the edge of the mess hall. They watched the cooks knead dough, fry potatoes, and arrange trays with almost ceremonial care. "Why do they do this?" muttered one older soldier, his eyes narrowing at the glistening fries. "Why not just give us bread and rice?" "Why this?" Sato swallowed hard, the taste of salt still lingering on his tongue from lunch. "It is respect," he said finally, unsure if the word even applied to what they were seeing. "Or maybe it is proof. Proof that even our enemies can have souls." A young prisoner laughed bitterly. "Souls?" he repeated. "We've been told our whole lives that they are monsters. And yet they feed us like this. Maybe they aren't monsters at all." Sato did not respond. Instead, he stared at the fries on his tray, at the thin trail of ketchup smeared across one corner. Each bite felt like a small betrayal, but also a revelation. He realized he was learning something profound, not about the Americans, necessarily, but about the world. That even in the midst of war, there could be moments that were entirely human, moments that were completely free of duty, strategy, or ideology. That evening, after the workday ended and the prisoners filed back to the barracks, a few lingered near the mess hall. They watched the steam curl from the trays, the sunlight glint off the golden fries, the smoke rising from the cook stoves. For the first time in months, the war felt like something distant, almost unreal. In its place was a strange, disorienting feeling, the sensation that life could exist outside the rigid structures they had been trained to obey. Sato thought of his mother, of the scarcity they had endured, of the rice counted grain by grain. Could she imagine this? The warmth of a fried potato, the sharp sweetness of a soda, the casual kindness of men who were supposed to be their enemies? It was almost unbearable to think of sharing this truth with her. And yet a small part of him, the part that had not yet been hardened completely by war, wanted desperately to believe that this was possible, that the world could hold kindness even in the teeth of conflict. That night, as the prisoners lay in their bunks, the conversations shifted. No longer did they speak of escape or revolt. They spoke instead of the simple mechanics of American life, the rhythm of meals, the abundance of oil, the sweetness of the soda, the warmth of the kitchens. Sato realized that they were beginning to understand something that could not be taught in Japan's schools, something that could not be drilled into soldiers' minds. The enemy, too, was human. And the knowledge unsettled him more than fear ever had. By early May, the rhythms of camp life had begun to sink into the prisoners' bodies like water into parched earth. They woke with the sun, worked in the fields, repaired fences, and returned to the barracks to eat meals that were as predictable as they were astonishing. The sizzle of French fries in the mess hall had become a constant, a steady heartbeat in the midst of the dissonance that filled their minds. They began to anticipate it with a mixture of hunger and awe, their hearts stirring even before the first tray was set down. Sato noticed that the men began to change in subtle ways. Where once they had walked with their heads bowed, shoulders tight with tension, they now moved with the faintest relaxation. Their eyes, once wary and calculating, lingered on small, ordinary details, the sunlight catching dust motes in the mess hall, the curl of steam over a pot, the laugh of an American cook at some private joke. They began to smile quietly at one another, a cautious recognition of shared astonishment. During one meal, Sato observed a younger prisoner, barely 17, struggling with a tray. The boy's hands trembled under the weight of the plates, and he glanced at the fries with suspicion, as if they might bite. Sato leaned over, speaking softly. "Eat, it is safe. You will not be punished for enjoying it." The boy looked up, eyes wide, and hesitated, then, slowly, picked up a fry, dipped it into the ketchup, and tasted it. His expression changed immediately, a flicker of joy cutting through exhaustion. He laughed softly, a sound that had not been heard in the camp in months. Sato felt a pang, a mixture of relief and guilt. Joy, in this context, felt like a betrayal of everything he had been trained to believe. The Americans did not force the prisoners to eat, yet they watched attentively, offering guidance, smiles, and gentle gestures. One cook, noticing a man staring at his plate, set a small bottle of ketchup in front of him and nodded. "Try," he said simply, as though the instruction were the most natural thing in the world. No lecture, no ridicule, no hint of expectation beyond curiosity. The simplicity of it struck Sato more than the food itself. It was not just that they fed prisoners, it was how they did it, patiently, without malice, without hurry. In the evenings, as work ended and the last tray was cleared, small groups gathered to talk quietly. They spoke of their homes, of rice fields and city streets left behind, of fathers, mothers, and children they had not seen in years. But always the conversation circled back to food. The fries, the soda, the warmth of the kitchens, these became symbols of a world they had not known existed. It was a world where abundance was not an insult, where comfort was not a weapon, and where an enemy could offer something without calculation or hidden cruelty. Sato began to dream of the mess hall. He saw the golden fries piled on trays, the steam rising like a ghostly curtain, the laughter of cooks, the warm sunlight glinting off the steel tables. In these dreams, he was no longer a soldier, no longer a prisoner. He was simply a man at a table, allowed to be human. When he woke, the memory lingered, heavy and strange. He realized that the lessons of these meals went beyond survival. They were lessons in trust, in empathy, in the unquantifiable ways that life could be offered without threat. And yet, the change was not easy. For every moment of quiet awe, there was guilt. Eating well, enjoying warmth, smiling, all of it felt like a betrayal of fallen comrades, of the rigid codes that had governed his life. Sato and the others struggled to reconcile the comfort they experienced with the shame that had been ingrained. It was a paradox they could not solve, only endure. The enemy was cruel, and yet kind. The war was real, and yet here was peace. The aroma of fries became their anchor, the taste of Coca-Cola a silent witness to a world they had never imagined. Each bite was a revelation, each sip a lesson in humanity. And though no one spoke it aloud, Sato knew the truth that hung over them. The war was not only fought in battles, but in these quiet, invisible confrontations between fear, pride, and unexpected mercy. By late May, the prisoners' routines had settled into a quiet, almost domestic rhythm. Work in the fields consumed the daylight hours, and the evenings were claimed by the mess hall, where the golden fries and cold, sweet Coca-Cola waited. Sato noticed that conversations had shifted. Gone were the whispered fears of escape or rebellion. Instead, the men compared textures, flavors, and techniques. "The oil," one said. "It is plentiful. In Japan, we measure every drop." Another nodded, dipping his fry in ketchup with care, as though performing a ritual. The meals had become a strange kind of education. The prisoners watched the Americans as much as they watched their food. They noticed how casually the cooks worked together, how the guards interacted without tension, how kindness was given freely and without expectation. It unsettled Sato. He had been trained to see the enemy as unfeeling, but here was proof of patience, of generosity, of a civilization that could wield abundance as naturally as they had wielded swords. At night, Sato lay awake on his bunk, replaying the day. The taste of fries lingered in his mouth, their warmth spreading through his chest. He thought of his mother, of the small portions of rice she would ration to the family, and he felt a pang of guilt. How could he reconcile this comfort with the suffering left behind? And yet, he could not deny the truth. The enemy had shown him a kind of humanity that Japan had long denied. Even the simplest gestures, a hand on the shoulder, a shared cigarette, a laugh over a spilled plate, struck him as extraordinary. It was not the magnitude of the acts that mattered, but their consistency. Each small kindness eroded the rigid walls of fear and hatred he had carried. And the fries, golden and crisp, became the symbol of this quiet, persistent mercy. June arrived with longer days and the promise of warmth. The snow was gone, replaced by mud-slicked fields and tender green shoots pushing through the soil. The prisoners worked steadily, their muscles stiff from months of labor, yet their minds lingered on the mess hall. The smell of fries frying in oil had become as natural as the wind in the trees, a constant reminder that life could exist beyond hunger and fear. Sato observed subtle changes in the men around him. One, who had refused to speak for weeks, now joked quietly with a neighbor over the size of a fry. Another, older and stooped, had begun humming a tune while cleaning his tray. The guards watched, smiling but saying nothing. The prisoners were learning something they could not have anticipated, that being treated as human could slowly reshape the soul. During lunch, Sato noticed a small ritual emerging. The prisoners lined their trays with fries first, treating them almost reverently before adding the rest of their meal. Even the simplest dip of ketchup became a deliberate act, a pause in which they allowed themselves a moment of pleasure. It was more than eating, it was learning to exist without the constant shadow of shame or fear. In the evenings, Sato lingered near the mess hall longer than necessary. He watched the cooks move with precision and ease, their faces open, their gestures unguarded. It was a kind of choreography that he had never seen outside of the battlefield, a world where creation replaced destruction, where abundance replaced scarcity. He felt a strange, almost forbidden curiosity. What did life feel like when cruelty was not expected? And yet, there was a quiet tension beneath it all. Every bite of fry, every sip of soda, reminded him of the contradiction at the heart of his existence. They were captives, yet treated with respect. They had surrendered, yet received kindness. The feelings it stirred were both comforting and terrifying. Sato realized he could not fully understand it, but he could taste it, and in that taste, A new kind of awareness began to take root. By midsummer, the prisoners had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, though the shadow of war remained. The days were long, the work hard, yet the mess hall continued to offer a quiet sanctuary. The sizzle of fries and hot oil had become a sound they unconsciously craved, a signal that, for a brief moment, the world could be simple and kind. Sato noticed how the prisoners began to imitate the Americans in subtle ways. They lined their trays neatly, carefully dipped fries in ketchup, and even began to exchange small smiles across the tables. It was a language without words, a shared acknowledgement of something larger than survival. Even the guards seemed to recognize it, offering small nods, their faces relaxed and patient. One afternoon, Sato watched a young soldier, no older than 16, marveling at a batch of fries. "Why do they make them like this?" he asked softly. Sato hesitated, then said, "Because they can. Because they can afford joy." The boy's eyes widened at the idea that life could be structured around pleasure rather than scarcity. It was an unfamiliar and almost shocking concept. At night, the barracks were filled with quiet reflection. The prisoners spoke little, but the unspoken bonds grew stronger. They had begun to trust, even if cautiously, that kindness could exist without hidden motives. The fries were no longer just food, they were proof that the enemy could be human, that the world might contain something beyond discipline, suffering, and duty. Yet for Sato, the conflict persisted. Enjoying the food, laughing at small jokes, even feeling curiosity, all of it felt like a betrayal of the code he had lived by. And still, he couldn't deny the warmth that spread through him each time he tasted those golden, salted strips. Each bite was a small defiance of everything he had been taught, a lesson that mercy could wound more profoundly than cruelty ever had. By July, the camp had grown quiet in a new way. The initial shock of abundance had worn off, replaced by routine, yet the prisoners were changed. The smell of fries frying in oil had become almost comforting, a familiar rhythm in their lives. Sato noticed how even the smallest gestures, a guard handing over a soda with a smile, a cook pausing to joke, now drew genuine reactions, laughter, nods, brief words of thanks. During one meal, Sato observed a group of prisoners comparing sauces. Ketchup, mustard, even a thin, sweet brown sauce they could not name. They debated which complemented the fries best, their tone light, almost playful. Such conversation would have been impossible in the first weeks. It was a quiet revolution of thought and spirit. To discuss flavor, not survival, was to reclaim a fragment of humanity. Sato reflected on how the Americans treated each other. They joked and gestured freely, shared food across tables, and spoke in a casual, unhurried manner. The prisoners had grown accustomed to seeing the enemy act without fear or calculation. It unsettled him profoundly. The men they had been told were monsters, capable of unimaginable destruction, were capable, too, of generosity and patience. That evening, Sato lingered near the cookhouse after the trays were cleared. He watched the fryers hiss and bubble, the cooks move with ease, their laughter spilling into the warm air. He realized that the food was more than nourishment, it was a bridge. Each golden fry was a small act of diplomacy, a challenge to the rigid ideologies that had driven men to kill one another. And yet, he could not fully reconcile his feelings. The pride and shame ingrained by years of training clashed with the undeniable comfort and joy he now experienced. Eating well felt like betrayal, and still, he couldn't stop. Each bite, each sip of soda, was a lesson, a wound, and a revelation all at once. Sato understood, more clearly than ever, that mercy could be dangerous, because it forced the mind to question everything it had been taught. By late July, the camp had settled into a strange, steady cadence. The prisoners woke before dawn, worked in the fields or repaired tools, and returned to the mess hall where the smell of frying potatoes greeted them like an old, impossible friend. It no longer felt unusual to see Americans laughing, joking, or sharing meals with them. Yet the sensation was disorienting. Comfort felt like a paradox, and Sato was still learning how to exist within it. During one lunch, Sato watched a small group of prisoners experiment with the fries. One added ketchup, another a sprinkle of sugar, and another simply ate them plain. The conversation was muted, almost reverent, as if they were handling something sacred. Sato realized that these simple acts were more than curiosity. They were an attempt to understand a way of life that seemed foreign yet magnetic. He reflected on the Nisei interpreter's words from months before. Now you're just men who are far from home. At first, he had not fully grasped the meaning. Now he understood. The Americans were not treating them as enemies or instruments of war. They were treating them as humans, capable of thought, feeling, and joy. It was a subtle revolution, one that unfolded in the quiet intimacy of shared meals. At night the barracks were filled with soft murmurs. Some men discussed home, some the flavors of food, and some simply sat in silence, letting the experience of kindness sink in. Sato often stared at his tray long after finishing, feeling the lingering warmth of the fries in his chest. It was a comfort he could not name, a tension between gratitude and shame, desire and disbelief. He began to notice how the small joys, the crispness of a fry, the sweetness of a soda, the warmth of a smile, were reshaping their relationships. Men who had been suspicious of one another now shared jokes, offered bites, and watched one another's faces with curiosity rather than fear. The war had forced them to distrust, to endure, to survive. But here, in the simple acts of eating together, a new lesson emerged: humanity could endure too. August arrived with heavy humidity, and the fields around the camp grew thick with green. The prisoners labored from dawn until dusk, yet the mess hall remained a constant haven. The scent of fries sizzling in oil carried across the grounds, a reminder that something ordinary could feel extraordinary when it arrived without expectation or malice. Sato noticed that the men's focus had shifted. They no longer simply endured, they observed, remembered, and savored. During one meal, a younger soldier asked Sato quietly, "Why do they give us so much? Why not just enough to fill our stomachs?" Sato paused, considering. "Because," he finally said, "they do not see you only as prisoners. They see you as men. And men deserve more than survival." The boy nodded, dipping his fry carefully into ketchup, tasting it like a treasure. Sato felt a pang. The simplicity of pleasure, so foreign, yet so essential, seemed to cut through the armor of years spent in fear and discipline. The Americans' gestures of kindness continued without fanfare. Guards shared their own sodas, cooks offered second servings, and laughter flowed naturally through the mess hall. The prisoners began to respond, hesitantly at first, then more openly. Quiet nods became smiles, brief jokes became laughter, and the long months of suspicion and fear slowly gave way to something new: recognition of shared humanity. Sato often stayed behind after meals, watching the fryers hiss, the steam curl, the cooks exchange casual banter. He realized that the food was more than sustenance. It was a signal, a quiet bridge between worlds that had been defined by war. Every crisp, salted fry was a testament to a life where abundance was normal, where comfort was expected, and where humanity could be expressed without calculation or fear. At night, lying on his bunk, Sato reflected on the contradictions he lived with. He was a captive, yet treated with dignity. He was a soldier, yet learning joy. Each bite of fry, each sip of soda, was a reminder that the world could hold complexity beyond honor and duty. The war had taught him survival, but the fries, golden and warm, were teaching him something deeper, that mercy and kindness could wound just as profoundly as cruelty. By September, the prisoners had fully adjusted to the rhythms of camp life, yet the novelty of the meals remained. The sizzle of fries, the golden gleam of oil, and the fizz of Coca-Cola were no longer shocking, but their effect on the men's minds persisted. They had begun to measure life not only in survival but in these fleeting moments of unexpected pleasure. Even the most skeptical soldiers now approached the mess hall with anticipation, their hunger tempered by curiosity. Sato noticed that the conversations among prisoners had shifted dramatically. Men compared flavors, debated sauces, and discussed the subtle differences in texture. These were discussions that would have seemed frivolous months ago, yet they now carried weight, because they were learning to think beyond survival. Each small debate, each shared laugh, was a step toward reclaiming a sense of self that war had attempted to strip away. The Americans, for their part, continued their quiet consistency. A guard would smile at a hesitant prisoner, a cook would offer an extra fry without question, and no one seemed to expect anything in return. The prisoners noticed the pattern: generosity without agenda, care without calculation. It was a form of discipline entirely different from what they had known, one that required patience, humanity, and restraint. Sato realized that they were being trained in empathy, almost unconsciously, by every meal, every gesture, every shared smile. That evening, Sato lingered in the mess hall as the trays were cleared. He watched the fryers hiss, steam curling into the warm air, the cooks wiping their hands and exchanging casual remarks. He thought about the contrasts between this life and the one he had left behind, the scarcity, the strict hierarchies, the unrelenting expectation of suffering. Here, even in captivity, life contained a strange abundance, a quiet dignity, and a capacity for joy. Sato felt the weight of it in his chest. The fries were no longer simply food. They were symbols, proof that the enemy could be human, that the world could contain generosity even amid conflict, and that pleasure could exist without guilt. And yet, with each bite, he also felt the tension between pride and gratitude, between what he had been taught and what he was learning. The contradiction was exhausting, beautiful, and terrifying, all at once. By October, autumn had begun to creep into the camp. The mornings were sharp with frost, and the fields were dotted with fallen leaves. The prisoners worked diligently, but their minds increasingly lingered on the mess hall, on the simple pleasures it offered. The smell of fries, the hiss of oil, and the sweetness of Coca-Cola had become more than sustenance. They were markers of a world that operated on rules entirely unfamiliar to them. Sato noticed changes that went beyond appetite. Men who had been silent, withdrawn, or suspicious now engaged quietly with each other, exchanging opinions on sauces, the texture of fries, and the proper way to enjoy a soda. It was a subtle kind of communion, a shared acknowledgement of something beyond fear or duty. In these moments, the walls between captor and captive, enemy and man, seemed to soften just slightly. During one meal, a prisoner asked Sato if he thought the Americans could truly be trusted. Sato considered the question, watching a cook hand a tray to a hesitant man with a warm smile. "Trust is difficult," he said finally, "but they show it in every act. That is more than words can tell us." The prisoner nodded slowly, taking a tentative bite. A faint smile spread across his face, and for a moment, the war felt very far away. Even the simplest gestures held weight. A guard offering a cigarette, a cook teasing a prisoner gently, the careful layering of fries on a tray, these small acts taught lessons the battlefield could not. Sato realized that humanity could be taught quietly, through consistency and care, and that these lessons could wound just as profoundly as any enemy attack. At night, Sato lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, recalling the smell of hot oil, the crunch of golden fries, and the cool fizz of a soda. The sensations were physical, yes, but they were also emotional. Each bite carried a message. That life could be more than survival, that comfort was not weakness, and that kindness could exist even in a world defined by conflict. He understood now that these lessons would stay with him long after he left the camp, shaping his perception of enemies, mercy, and humanity itself. By November, the days had grown short and the air crisp, the fields turning brown and brittle under the early frost. Yet inside the mess hall, warmth persisted. The smell of fries frying in oil still floated through the room, accompanied by the gentle hum of conversation and laughter. It had become an anchor for the prisoners, a rhythm that grounded them in a world that had once seemed defined only by fear and survival. Sato observed a subtle shift among the men. Where once suspicion governed every glance and gesture, there was now a quiet attentiveness, a willingness to watch, to listen, to notice small details. A fry perfectly golden, a soda poured without spill, a guard pausing to ensure a man had enough, these became points of fascination. They were learning to see not just food, but intention, care, and a fragile kind of order that contrasted sharply with the chaos of war. One afternoon, as he cleaned the tables, Sato noticed the young prisoner carefully arranging fries on his tray before taking a bite. The precision seemed almost ritualistic. "Why do you do that?" Sato asked. The boy shrugged. "Because it is important," he said softly. Sato nodded, understanding immediately. The act of care, however small, was a lesson in itself, a quiet defiance of the neglect and scarcity that had dominated their lives for years. Even the guards seemed to participate in this unspoken lesson. They smiled, joked, and engaged in small acts of kindness without ceremony or expectation. Sato realized that these gestures, repeated daily, were teaching more than survival or obedience. They were teaching trust, patience, and the possibility of joy. The golden fries and cold soda were the medium through which these lessons were delivered, simple yet profound. At night, Sato lay on his bunk, thinking of the world outside the camp, of the cities and towns ravaged by war, and of the endless rules he had lived by in Japan. Here, in this strange enclave of mercy, he was learning that life could exist differently, with abundance, kindness, and small pleasures that were not earned through suffering. The fries had become more than food. They were evidence of a reality he could scarcely articulate, a world where humanity endured despite everything. Winter approached again, and the camp was quiet under a pale gray sky. The fields lay dormant, and the prisoners' work had slowed with the season, but the mess hall remained a constant refuge. The smell of fries frying in hot oil and the sharp sweetness of Coca-Cola had become part of their lives, a rhythm as familiar as the cold wind outside. To Sato and the others, these small comforts now carried weight far beyond mere hunger. By this time, the men had grown used to observing the Americans, not with fear, but with a careful curiosity. They noticed the casual care with which food was prepared, the patience with which guards guided hesitant prisoners, the small gestures of humor and camaraderie that flowed naturally across tables. Sato realized that these acts, so ordinary to the Americans, were extraordinary to them. They were lessons in humanity, delivered quietly, day by day, bite by bite. Sato himself had changed. He no longer approached meals with suspicion, nor did he fear kindness. He ate slowly, savoring the golden fries, noting the warmth and salt, the fizz of the soda on his tongue. Each taste carried with it the impossible lesson that enemies could act with compassion, that comfort could exist alongside conflict, and that life could be more than duty or survival. Yet he also felt the tension of guilt. For accepting pleasure, for enjoying abundance, for allowing himself to hope in a world built on deprivation. One evening, as the prisoners lingered after clearing trays, Sato watched a guard toss a fry into the air and catch it with a grin. The prisoners laughed, tentative but genuine. In that moment, the distinctions between captive and captor, enemy and human, blurred. The war had brought them here, but the lessons of mercy, kindness, and simple joy were teaching them something far deeper, that humanity could survive even in the teeth of destruction. As he lay in his bunk that night, Sato reflected on the months behind him. The fries, the soda, the warmth of the kitchens, the laughter of the cooks, they were symbols of a world he had never imagined, a world in which kindness could wound, and comfort could transform. The war had shaped him, but so had these small, golden lessons. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself a quiet thought, almost a hope, that perhaps the world could be rebuilt, not from fear or duty, but from mercy, generosity, and the simple warmth of a shared meal. By December, the first transports for repatriation had been scheduled. The prisoners worked their last days in the fields, the air crisp and filled with the scent of frost, while the mess hall still offered its daily ritual of warmth. The smell of fries sizzling and the sharp sweetness of Coca-Cola had become an unspoken anchor, a quiet promise that life could be ordinary, even amid war. Sato watched the younger men, now more confident and relaxed, gathering their trays, discussing flavors and techniques as if they were apprentices in some secret culinary school. The shift was profound. Men who had entered the camp suspicious, wary, and silent now laughed quietly with one another. Even the guards paused to smile at small victories, a well-fried batch of potatoes, a perfectly poured soda, unaware of the psychological impact their simple routines had wrought. Yet for Sato, the approaching departure stirred conflicting emotions. He was eager to return home, to see his family, to reclaim the life he had left behind. But he was also acutely aware that leaving this strange world of abundance and care would be like stepping back into the shadows of scarcity and suspicion. The lessons of the fries, the soda, and the uncalculated kindness were heavy now, a weight he would carry quietly. On the last evening before the first group left, Sato lingered in the mess hall, watching the steam curl from trays, the fryers hiss, the cooks laugh as they worked. He realized that these ordinary acts, preparing food, sharing meals, offering smiles, had changed him. They had shown that mercy could exist, that comfort could heal, and that humanity could survive even in the most improbable circumstances. He ate his fries slowly that night, savoring every bite, knowing it might be years before he experienced such care again. And as he raised the glass of Coca-Cola to his lips, he allowed himself a quiet thought, almost a prayer, that the world he was returning to could remember these small lessons, that kindness, even in the enemy, was a force stronger than hatred. The day of departure came with a gray sky and a cold wind that cut through their coats. Trucks carried the prisoners to the docks, where ships awaited to take them home. Sato and the others carried their few belongings, their bodies leaner, their faces showing traces of fatigue, but also a new, subtle calm. They had endured, yes, but they had also learned something unexpected, that the enemy could be humane, that comfort could exist even in captivity, and that small kindnesses could leave indelible marks. On board the ship, Sato found a quiet corner and remembered the months in the camp, the scent of fries, the hiss of oil, the sweetness of soda, the laughter of cooks, the smiles of guards. These memories were small, almost ordinary, yet they carried weight far beyond their physical presence. They were proof that life could be generous, that humanity could persist, and that joy could coexist with sorrow and guilt. Letters home had been written, carefully measured, omitting much of what they had experienced. Yet Sato carried the truth inside him. Not just survival, not just health, but the strange, piercing lesson of mercy. He thought of his mother, of the rice they rationed at home, and understood that the world he had returned to would be different in ways she could never imagine. He would never speak fully of the fries or the soda, yet they had changed him irrevocably. The ship crossed the ocean in silence, the prisoners staring at the endless gray horizon, thinking of home and of the life they had left behind. Sato felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. He would honor the lessons learned, not with words, but in action. That mercy, that kindness, that simple warmth of food freely given, it would guide him, even in a world scarred by war. And as the coastline of Japan appeared, distant and fragile in the morning light, Sato allowed himself a small, almost forbidden smile. The war had ended, but the lessons of that strange, golden, salted mercy would follow him forever.